Hello, everybody. I decided I wanted to record a video about a concept that's been kind of bothering me for a while. But before you can understand my perspective, I'll have to give a little bit of background. My daughter is a national champion wrestler and participated in boxing since she was 7 years old. She's actually not overly butch or any of those like adjectives you would probably expect. When you talk to her, she actually has like the personality of a Disney character. But she's also very intelligent and a very nice person, but she is what I would call a strong woman, physically and intellectually. There is a term that keeps being thrown around by feminists called toxic masculinity. And I think the problem really is more to do with just the fact that they kind of throw it at everything. It's a term that's getting overused. And that the model of male that they would prefer is, at least that they say they would prefer, is not actually, well, to put it mildly, it's not masculine at all anymore. But regardless, I also, however, feel that there is something that I would refer to as the toxic feminine. And I've encountered these personalities quite a bit throughout my life in different things that I participated in, hobbies and such. And they're just as dangerous as toxic men, and they're just as uh, destructive. But I would say it's like a different flavor because women usually don't use the same means of manipulation that men do, at least not in the same way. People therefore assume that they don't, do things that are controlling. The truth is, the toxic feminine applies to a girl, often a beautiful girl, but not always, who understands that their appearance gives them a certain degree of, shall we say, privilege. They know that being pretty will get them a certain amount of power. It gives them a certain amount of influence and the ability to manipulate, particularly men. And this isn't to say that women cannot be domineering and cruel, because they certainly are with each other on a regular basis. So much so that my daughter and my mother both didn't really have a lot of female friends. But this is the type of woman that doesn't really get a lot of attention. And unfortunately, they come also in different levels of, I would say, competence. The issue that, as far as feminism is concerned, is that we now have an ideology that's telling girls that not only are they as good as men automatically in everything they do, that actually they're superior. Not all feminists say this, but an awful lot of them do. And then a good degree of them kind of say this without just spitting it out. Like, it's in the back of their mind. That's how they feel. When you say things like mansplaining, for example, you know, you're trying to identify that, how dare a man even debate with you? Like, and there are men out there who do just look down at a girl and think that they don't know what they're talking about. But that doesn't actually make up the majority of the population. The funny thing that I would point out, as I mentioned in one of my recent broadcasts, was the case of Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard had the support of literally just about every Trump supporter I know, even though they're supposed to be all misogynistic, women hating people, and that's why they didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. And the truth is, Tulsi Gabbard projects herself as a woman with leadership qualities and a genuinely strong woman. The fact that she came from the background of being a major in the military has a lot to do with it, I'm sure. And if you want to experience what I'm talking about, go and watch her first Joe Rogan interview. That's when I would feel would really get what I'm talking about. And even if you don't agree with a lot of Tulsi's policies, it doesn't matter, um, because there's certain qualities about her that exude the right kind of confidence and charisma to be a leader. This is something Hillary Clinton did not have. And it's something that a lot of women wish they had, or rather would imagine that they have, but they don't. And it's not because they can't. I want to be clear. My mother's upbringing, and therefore my daughter's upbringing and my sister's upbringing, plays a pivotal role in this situation. But a large part of it has to do with, to create a strong woman, you have to put them in circumstances that make anyone, male or female, strong. If you coddle them and you give them their way all the time, just like anybody else, male or female, they're not going to become strong. If they're used to having everything handed to them, they're not going to become strong. And one of the things that I kind of came to an epiphany about, because getting my daughter to get to where she was in the sport of wrestling and the sport of boxing, I had to spend time around a lot of very real, strong women. And I noticed that virtually none of them behave anything like the women that claim that the reason that I don't agree with them about certain topics is because I don't like strong women. Or perhaps the reason that I don't like certain movies is because I don't like strong women. Now, that's horseshit. I love strong women, and I have since I was younger. In fact, I had a huge crush on Linda Hamilton from Terminator 2. I had one on Ripley from Aliens. And that's actually a perfect example of what I mean by, a strong woman who has leadership qualities that are recognized by the men around her. Aliens was made back in the 80s, and Ripley, a civilian pilot, took command of a platoon of Marines because she proved that she was the most competent person to do the job, not just because she had encountered the alien creatures before, but because she was a genuinely good leader and a strong personality who understood how to organize and motivate people. These are skills that can be learned, but there is a talent for them that can make that process easier. So there's a moment in Game of Thrones, that's the reason why we're looking at a picture of Cersei Lannister, that I feel kind of like went off like fireworks in my head, because it helped me understand what my problem was when I was debating certain, females who had been empowered by this ideology. And I say empowered in quotes, because they're not actually powerful. They're not necessarily strong. They've just been told to believe that they are. I'll get into that scene in a second, but there's another moment that kind of comes to my mind, and I discussed this with Villain Report, was that sometimes you see these girls in Antifa, and they get up to the front lines of their fights with the Proud Boys. And for some reason, they just think they're going to start swinging their fists at men that are 3 times their size, and they get laid out. And frequently, they get this confused look on their face, like, why didn't that go the way I thought it would? I'm the strong female. Obviously, I should have prevailed. The same thing comes with the recent reviews of the Black Widow film that said it would make women, or rather make men squeam and put them in their place. And I love movies about strong women, and I actually really like Scarlett Johansson, and Black Widow was okay. But it's a hell of a lot easier to be a dominant, strong woman when CGI fight scenes are making you look invincible. See Captain Marvel. The current breed of feminist women seem to want to alter reality in such a way that they can be strong without having to put in any of the work. My daughter went on to be a starter in our wrestling team that is actually one of the best wrestling teams in the country, not just in Michigan, and set a historical precedent by doing so. She had to bust her ass to get there. And once she did, all of the men on that team respected her, including the coach. That was something she earned by demonstrating that she was, in fact, a strong woman. And the fact that she was a woman wasn't even relevant to them anymore. She demonstrated that she could do the job. So, getting to this clip, however, points at what happens when a woman is not as strong as they actually perceive themselves to be, and how dangerous they can be. Game of Thrones has an excellent complement of female characters who are strong and are capable. Like the head of the Tyrell family, for example, is a perfect opponent for Tywin Lannister, who's in this clip as well. just as shrewd, just as intelligent, just as capable, just as fearless. And Tywin Lannister is considered to be like one of the biggest badasses in modern cinema history, without being strong or physically imposing, being mentally imposing, being capable of understanding and grasping the nuances, but more importantly, being able to control their emotions when necessary to be able to get what needs to be done. There are other examples. Brienne of Tarth is a perfect example of a legitimate, genuine, strong female. She puts in the work, she becomes an amazing swordswoman, and she defeats even Jaime Lannister. She's a fantastic character, great role model for any girl who wants to become a strong woman. But when you compare them to, say, Cersei Lannister, now you have a different issue. Cersei is beautiful. She is just smart enough to get herself into trouble, would be the term that pops up into my head. And to give you a little background on this particular scene, leading up to this, she notices that another strong and capable woman, which is the woman that was betrothed to her son, was starting to get some influence over her son, which is something very difficult to do because her son is a nasty, toxic masculine asshole who doesn't normally listen to anyone. But more than that, Cersei is troubled by the fact that Margaery, the name of the character in question who would be queen, is getting the power of the people behind her. That she is clearly demonstrating that she knows how to make people like her in a genuine way. And this threatens Cersei's perspective as far as her position in the court. That's what she's really worried about. She goes on to tell her father, and I don't actually clip that out of this particular clip, but to say that they're a problem and they should be dealt with. And her father sets her straight and says, those people are the reason that you're even alive, because they were powerful allies. But from the perspective of the toxic female, anybody who threatens their position in the tribe, so to speak, is a threat that needs to be eliminated, even if that decision would actually be very dangerous to her family. They don't think that far ahead, because Tywin will explain really why. But again, it comes back to not quite as capable as they believe they are. This also has to do with many other things that Cersei does throughout the course of the series, including having affairs with her brother, her cousins, just all kinds of different situations that kind of exemplify that she's actually not very strong. She can't control her impulses. She can't handle herself in any way, including, doing dangerous things that could very easily destroy her family. But that's what feels good to her in the moment. And again, I want to say, men are also capable of all of this. It's just a different flavor. So now I'm going to play this clip because I had been trying to put my finger on exactly what it was that I sensed was going on when I debate with women in these kinds of arguments. And he put it in the perfect, most simplest terms. Let's take a look.
Did it ever occur to you that I might be the one who deserves your confidence and your trust? Not your sons, not Jaime or Tyrion, but me. Years and years of lectures on family and legacy. The same lecture, really, just with tiny, tedious variations. Did it ever occur to you that your daughter might be the only one listening to them, living by them? That she might have the most to contribute to your legacy? That you love so much more than your actual children?
I don't distrust you because you're a woman. I distrust you because you're not as smart as you think you are.
Ouch. I'm sure that's not the answer she was expecting. Although it's totally true. When it comes to this person in this situation, that's really what her problem is. She thinks she's a lot smarter than she actually is. And feminism is creating this same problem in a whole generation of girls, that they don't have realistic understandings of their capabilities, which I might add is the limiting factor in question, not their gender. She could become considerably more formidable. She could become considerably more wise, but she already believes herself to already be there. So she's blind to the rest of the rungs of the ladder that she could climb up. One of the problems when you're discussing like knightly virtues and such, which is something that's part of one of my hobbies, the major problem with being prideful and arrogant is that you can't see that you're wrong because you only can believe that you're right. You can't even perceive the fact that you have things to work on yet, that you're not where you believe you are. And if you're blind to that truth, you can never improve because you already think you know everything. You're not as smart as you think you are. That's something that I think everybody should be able to hear. But in this particular instance, and with these particular groups of people, meaning feminists of this generation, this is an epidemic. And it creates situations that are really causing women to unfortunately have very unfulfilling and unhappy lives. And they often don't realize it until it's too late. So now there's something else I want to show you that was actually the reason I made this video in the first place. Now, to give you a little background on this is an episode of The Dragon's Den, which is basically like Shark Tank in England. It's a reality show where a group of entrepreneurs, or rather a pair or usually a single entrepreneur, presents an idea to wealthy people to try to convince them to invest in their idea. And one of the things that Jordan Peterson points out is that when they did real research in, I believe it was Iceland, it was the country that was known to be the least sexist country on the planet, where so many laws had been passed to ensure things like the gender pay gap doesn't happen and that everybody's treated equally in all of the professions. And the really strange thing happened was that with these freedoms being presented and everything being equal, women actually still gravitated to the same professions that they were, and men still gravitated to the situations that they prefer as far as work. In fact, the gap increased. It didn't decrease. There is empirical data available to show this. And I want to be clear about something. That doesn't mean you have to do those things, because there are women who make excellent engineers. There are women who make excellent leaders. There are women who make excellent fighters. There's nothing wrong with that. But the assumption that women don't become these things because they can't is only marginally impacted by sexism. Even if you don't have sexism, there are certain elements, traits that you have to have in order to be good at something. And that's true of men or women. Let me give you an example. Football. In football, you don't send the tiny, fast kid to the line to become an offensive or defensive lineman. You have them become the wide receiver. Not because they're male. Obviously, that's not what the issue is. Not because of their race, but because small and quick people make good wide receivers, but make very bad linemen. So one of the jokes that came up, and it wasn't actually a joke. Jordan Peterson was debating somebody, and they were talking about how, women are underrepresented in certain professions. And he countered with, well, women are also underrepresented in bricklaying. Women are also underrepresented in sewage cleanup. But there's a reason for that. And it has to do with the fact that most women, not all, but a lot of women tend to have interests, and not just interests, but talents and intuitions when it comes to dealing with people. And men usually, not always, have talents, and abilities that are more related to things. This is not about inferior or superior. They both need to work together. And I want to be clear. I'm like probably one of the least patriarchal people you'll ever meet. I was raised by a single mom, and my father was a complete useless waste when it came to my childhood. There are a lot of people in my life that, I just finally just cut him off and never talked to him again. And regardless, there are women in my life that I would follow into any situation. There are men in my life that I would never follow, ever. But anyway, so let's get into this video. What we're about to see is that these two women are about to give a presentation to the Dragon's Den. to the dragons. The dragons are wealthy people who you're trying to convince to invest in your company idea or your entrepreneurial concept.
Hello, my name's Jude Camplin. This is Chrissy Shaw. We've come here today for investment in our two companies, Evolution Solutions and Evolve Through Training. The investment we're looking for is £150,000 for 20%. Evolution Solutions is a construction company which champions women in the construction industry. That means that wherever possible, we employ women tradespeople.
So I want to take a quick moment to note, have you ever noticed how many of these kinds of people seem to say they have anxiety? Like, meaning by these kinds of people, I'm referring to women who come from the current wave of feminism. She seems to have anxiety, and I don't know if she's trying to elicit a certain response from the people around her, which I do often see. Sometimes people say they have anxiety because they want people to treat them differently. Sometimes they have legitimate anxiety. Whatever it is, this person either is displaying anxiety. And you can see, and by the way, there is a legitimate strong female in this video. I'm sure you'll be able to figure out who she is shortly. It doesn't give a good look. Let's continue.
Evolution Solutions started trading in September 2005.
Nerves are getting the better of Jude. She'll have to regain her composure quickly to stand any chance of persuading the dragons to invest.
We champion women in the construction industry. Housing associations have to hit diversity targets. We solve that problem for them. There are some environments men just can't go into. There's refuges, sheltered housing. We also have a lot of anecdotal evidence which also says that customers just prefer women in their homes. You know, that's probably because of the much televised pot-bellied builder rummaging through your knicker drawer that you know, gets that perception, but it's out there and it is about trust. Chris is going to talk about Evolve Through Training.
Right. There's two sides to the business. As you've heard, there's the building company. We also have an academy, right? The academy is set out over 3 sites in Derby, and it was designed specifically to deliver good quality construction training to everyone. The academy will deliver City and Guilds accredited training through intensive courses in 5 aspects of the construction trades. I'll hand you back to Jude.
We want an academy and a construction company in every major city of the UK within 10 years. We also want to see a woman on every building site within 5 years. So thank you for your time, and please ask any questions.
Thank you.
So their business model is that they want to open up an academy for women in construction in every city, and that they want to have at least one woman on every construction site within so many years. Let's see how this plays out.
After a shaky start, Jude and Chrissy have made it through their pitch. They're asking for £150,000, but the 20% equity they're offering in return is split between 2 companies. It's an unusual deal, and Deborah Meaden needs some clarification.
I need to understand those 2 companies. How does that work?
Evolution Solutions has been trading a lot longer. Evolve Through Training is launching in August, as Chrissy said.
Okay, and what's the turnover on Evolve Through Training?
We're probably looking at about 500,000 in the first year.
So there's at the moment, no turnover in either of the businesses?
No, Evolution Solutions has been trading since September 2005, and up until April, we turned over only about £150,000.
And out of the 150,000, how much does that drop into profit?
I'm going to be totally honest, not a lot. This year, we've made a loss.
Are you offering us 20% of each of your companies?
Yes, we're
No,
offering
no,
you
no, no, no.
20% of
Both
both of the
companies.
companies.
So that's 20% split up. So 5% Evolve Through Training, 15% Evolution Solutions.
Hey, how does that work? How does that work?
What do you mean, how does it work? 5% of evolved through
You're actually
training.
giving me 5% of one company and 15 over the other. You're not
Yeah.
giving me 20%, are you?
Well, all right, 20% is combined over both companies.
No, it doesn't work like that. One could be worth £100, right? And you give me 20% of it. That's 20 quid. Yeah?
Yeah.
Keep it simple. And the other
Thank
one
you.
could be worth.
We are women.
So here comes the mansplaining accusation. They just admitted that one of these companies that they're asking people to invest in is failing. And they also kind of tried to obfuscate what they were really asking for, because it really only involves 15% of one company and 5% of another. So they just told this guy, he said, well, let's just keep it simple, because he's trying to break down what it is as far as to how companies work and how the math works. To which he replied, well, yeah, we are women. Just again, suggesting that he's mansplaining. This is textbook example of what they say is mansplaining, because he's right and they're wrong. And so the easy way out of confronting that is to just accuse him of being sexist. Let's continue.
We do. I apologise, but we face
You've
this
got a
every
terrible
day.
attitude.
I tell you, on that point, I've got a serious issue with that comment.
Well,
Do you know how many women I work with?
yeah, yes.
Do you want to have a guess?
No, I don't know.
No,
I
no.
can imagine. I
No,
can imagine.
please have a guess.
I've no idea. I don't know who. To be perfectly honest,
You
I
don't
don't
know
know.
who we are. You've pitched up, asked for £150,000
Yeah.
for 20%, which is
Yeah.
actually 5% of one company and 15% of another company.
Yeah.
You don't know who we are. You made a flippant comment about.
it's not flippant. It's very serious.
No, you made
to
a very
us.
flippant
it's
comment.
Very serious.
Because if
to
you'd done your
us.
homework, you wouldn't have made a comment.
You notice how her anxiety attack rapidly ended the moment she was triggered? All of a sudden now, instead of being the, little Oliver saying, please, sir, can we have some more investment? She's suddenly confrontational. All starting with her calling the guy sexist. Now, all of a sudden, she's got all the quote-unquote strength in the world. What kind of strength is it? There's a difference between being boss and being bossy. There's a difference between being strong in your understanding of something or just having a strong opinion.
Jude has incensed Theo Paphitis. Deborah Meaden tries to steer the discussion back to business.
How about we start again and you talk us through your business model and how we make some money, and just want to understand the
Right.
business. Can you explain to me why you think there aren't more women in the construction industry at the moment?
If you've got 20 men and 1 woman vying for a position in a building company as a trainee, whether you like it or not, men still choose to take on men. That is a fact as well.
Do you know you're beginning to sound like a crusade?
It's a
rather than a
campaign. It's a
business?
campaign because it's a niche market. There's a niche in the market.
Jude's approach to the business is not impressing the Dragons. Peter Jones is ready to have his say.
Using words like campaigning, using words like "I want a woman on every building site."
We do.
Well,
Because there are women
do you
out
not
there
see
that
the
don't have that
alienation? Do you not see the
opportunity.
alienation that will ensue?
No.
Well, you've already got 5 dragons pretty hacked.
Now, one of the things she just said was that the women don't have that opportunity. There's nothing to stop women from starting on construction jobs. I'm sure that they will encounter some sexism. I'm not questioning that. But the opportunity is there. That's not what the issue is. The interest is there. It's true that less women get hired for these jobs. It's also true that less women apply for them in the first place.
Well, I'm
If
sorry
you can
about
do
that.
that
I
in
really
5
am.
minutes, what are you
because
going to do when you go into the open market and try and
we've
sell
done
your
it and we've
services?
succeeded. We have got the attention of housing associations
You
and
have
authorities
succeeded.
that are
You've
very
succeeded at
happy.
nothing.
That's not strictly true either.
You haven't got a business that makes any money, and you haven't even started a trading business.
She said that her success was that they were getting the attention of certain housing organizations or whatever, who were excited, of course, because in some cases, trying to be woke can help make you some money. But the problem is that she doesn't actually have the capability to run this business, and that's why it's failing, which is the reason she's asking other people to bail her out. And if they won't, it won't be because she can't demonstrate that her business model works, which she clearly can't. it's going to be because they're sexist.
Now Jude and Chrissy have been blasted by Peter Jones. With emotions running high in the den, Richard Farley steps in to find out what sets their businesses apart from rival construction and training companies.
You've got a business, the evolution is about hiring out women, is that right? Or women and men?
Men and women.
Both.
Men
Men
and
and
women.
women.
And the academy is for men and women. So
Yes.
you've got two businesses.
Yes.
The unique thing about the academy is what?
We deliver not only construction training, but the whole package. We'll address customer focus.
Okay, so nothing to do with men and women.
No,
No,
Then you've got this construction business, which is unique in what sense?
because we do offer women tradespeople as well as men.
Okay.
We give customers the choice.
You're saying that your construction company, there is a demand out there for people who do want women.
Yeah,
Is that right?
absolutely.
It's slightly confusing because your unique selling point is that you've got a high ratio of women, but you still have men.
Yes.
If you come and pitch an idea or your concept, actually said, look, do you know what? My most critical success factor to my whole business model is the fact that I'm going to focus exclusively on women. My whole business model is going to be based around putting more women into construction industry.
Do you see the way she rolled her eyes and now is shaking her head?
In key areas where actually they add value, really good quality people that were trained through you, Chrissy. They then move over to the business once they're trained, and you then tender the contracts exclusively. You are the female side of the construction industry. I think you now start to have a really good business.
I don't know whether we can actually do that because of the Discrimination Act.
But you know, this is something you should really find out because
I think you should
Well,
be
we've
certain.
stopped.
if
We
it's your
have.
unique selling point,
Yeah,
then you should really find out.
What I want to say, and I'm going to complete here, is that what you've come in to try and pitch, you've pitched it in such a discriminating way. Your attitude has to change from focusing on the discrimination to focusing on the key benefit. I'm not going to invest in you, so I'm out.
Peter Jones has heard enough. He's the first dragon out. Theo Paphitis, who clashed with Jude from the start, has also made up his mind.
You came here today looking for someone to invest in you a huge amount of money. If you'd done some homework, you'd have come up here in front of the Five Dragons and made a pitch that might have just persuaded us or invest in you £150,000. I don't believe you're investable, and I won't be investing, so I'm out.
Now, I can't back you either because you haven't demonstrated that you found a clear way forward. And so I think you need to learn those lessons before someone can just give you 150,000 to play with. And the uphill climb that you've got to undertake, I'm going to drop out as well. So thank you.
With Theo Paphitis, Richard Farley and Peter Jones all out, Jude and Chrissy's chances of securing £150,000 are hanging by a thread. Has Deborah Meaden heard anything that will tempt her to back the pair?
Jude, Chrissy, I think you might be onto something if you listen to the advice. Do you know my big concern is watching you, Jude? When you get advice, there's a big sigh and there's a but. You're doing it. Exactly that. That is exactly the point.
Yeah, but I
That's
listen
it.
to everybody
The
and
thing is,
everything.
what we are in here today to look for business opportunities. What you brought to us was a debate that you instigated over discrimination, over women in the workplace, over crusading and campaigning. That's how you started. We have helped you to bring this back onto a business platform. But every single time we try to talk about something you don't like to hear, you're very, very defensive. Anyway, you're doing it again, Jude. You're not listening to me. So I'm afraid for that reason, I'm out.
So that's what happens when the actual strong woman in the room gives her the truth. She can't handle it. She's just acting like a petulant child, and she's an adult. And unfortunately, this is the kind of adults that are coming out of this generation. And it sucks. Don't get me wrong. Again, men are capable of doing all of these things too. And with the demasculization of boys to the point that they're not even allowed to be healthy boys mentally, you're going to get more of this. So let's just kind of finish it out to its unfortunate conclusion.
It looks all but over for Jude and Chrissy. Only Duncan Bannatyne now stands between them and expulsion from the den.
I've just found you rude, offensive, very sexist, very discriminatory. I employ a lot of women. I employ more women than I employ men, and they do a fantastic job. Would I employ you? No. Would I invest in you? No. Never. So I'm out.
I've heard worse.
If you've heard worse,
It's just something.
if
It's
you've
just
heard
something-
worse and you keep hearing it,
Yeah, but
and you keep going to a place and you get up, try going in without that chip on your shoulder. You're the only person who's right. We're all wrong.
Yeah.
Everybody's wrong. You've got a massive chip on your shoulder
No,
and
I
a
haven't.
terrible attitude. That's your problem.
Fine.
With the words of a furious Duncan Bannatyne ringing in their ears, Jude and Chrissy are leaving the den empty-handed, and the dragons are smouldering.
Well, that was the hardest work trying to understand a business in that model that I've ever heard. Did we discuss business?
No.
Were there actually any?
Do you know what? She hasn't got a chip on her shoulder. She's finely balanced. She's got one on each shoulder.
Yeah, well said. Well said, Theo.
Jude, Chrissy, are you blaming yourselves?
Nope. They loved me, didn't they?
Were you aggressive or nervous?
How does that work?
Well, what do you mean? How does it work? That is unfortunately my manner. I am.
You're like that.
Yeah, yeah. I say what we both say. What we believe in.
What about?
How do you go from having a panic attack in the middle of your presentation to, no, I'm a strong woman. I say what I believe in? How do those two things coexist in your personality? One of them is not genuine.
About the chip on your shoulder.
No, not a chip.
don't
I
think-
get frustrated, and when you want to change something for the better, and the reason you can't is because you're a woman, you know, it does vex me.
It can't possibly have anything to do with the fact that they gave a presentation that said you'd get 20%, that really meant 15 of one and 5 of another. And then you spend your whole time rolling your eyes and acting like a kid because they're trying to tell you, meaning they who have actually succeeded, including the woman in the room, and you who have been failing. It doesn't evoke any kind of confidence. I would never want to work for this woman.
I've heard worse. I don't apologise for how I am. I have to be like this to survive in the industry. And
But it's because you're like this that you're not surviving in the industry. That's the point. You think you know it all already. You're not as smart as you think you are. And that's why I don't trust you. So to cap this off, I want to use this comparison because I think that these two characters in Star Wars perfectly personify what I'm talking about. The one on the left started off with a chip on her shoulder, went through a lot of trials and tribulations, bumps and bruises, made very legitimate, human mistakes, and came out on top of them to become wise and strong and powerful. The process of this is what made her strong and powerful. She had natural talents. Her personality initially gave her some trouble, but it's largely because she starts the show as a kid. She overcame those adversities and emerged out the other side, a respected comrade of a lot of powerful male characters in the storyline. The character on the right, on the other hand, somehow magically was automatically better at fixing the Millennium Falcon than Han Solo, was automatically better at using the Force, not just better than Luke Skywalker, but apparently better than anybody ever without any training, and was able to defeat a Sith Lord, of course, a male villain character, without any training at all, even though he had been trained. She basically just kind of has everything handed to her. And one of these characters represents the truth of how to become a strong female. The other character is fiction, as far as that is concerned. Despite the fact they're both fictional characters, what I'm getting at is that there is a path for girls to become strong women. I raised one. My mom was one. But there is no magical reworking of reality that suddenly just gives you these things. It doesn't work like that for any gender, for any race. So at the end of the day, what really bothers me the most about this is not about women versus men. It's about the fact that there are women who are strong, and girls can be strong. They can be encouraged to explore their talents. They could be encouraged, to do the work. They can be given, the encouragement to do that. And that's important. There's no question that that's important. But it's going to look like the girl on the left as far as the experience, not the girl on the right. And if we tell women that just by virtue of being women, say going into, I don't know, the engineering field, that they're automatically going to be better, they're going to be in for a world of hurt if that's the only reason why they have confidence, because the real world's going to come crashing down on them. It's the same thing if a woman wants to be a firefighter, if a woman wants to be a soldier. I encourage anybody to explore anything that they feel passionate about. But if you're in that situation, don't expect it to be handed to you. Because unlike when we're making woke movies to make women feel stronger or smarter than they actually are, in the real world, you're going to have to actually be able to prove it and do it. And if you do this and you emerge from the other side, you'll be a genuine, strong woman. And you won't have to worry about asking for respect. You'll get it. You'll have earned it. It'll happen on its own, organically. Thanks for listening. Hello, everybody. This is just going to be a quick update on the situation at the Wii Spa. I finally got to watch a video that has some of the argument, I guess, that Antifa thinks they're making in this situation. I'm going to share that video with you now, and I'm not sure necessarily that this makes me less confused. You be the judge.
I'm not attacking you. I'm not hurting you. I'm asking you a question. Are you here because you believe in trans rights and women's rights? Not anything else. Those two specific things. It's
I'm
yes
here
or no.
because I believe in
Yes or no?
Oh, fuck
off. Honey, you're not here for the right reasons. I don't.
Fuck you. Have dignity and respect. I think that women have the right to
As a female, I identify as both female and trans, and I'm not binary.
Wait, what did she just say?
As a female, I identify as both female and trans, and I'm not binary.
How the hell do you identify as both female and trans and non-binary? No, seriously, how can you be all three of those things? Because if she identifies as a female, and she's clearly biologically female, and she somehow identifies as trans and is non-binary, like, what the fuck?
I have the right to be in spaces where I feel safe. If a trans woman needs to be in a woman's space to be safe, that is her right. That is her right. I am a biological pussy-having person, okay? I have a uterus.
women don't feel safe with male genitalia in their private space.
So here we come into the situation where the left eats its tail, because she's saying that she has a right to feel safe, even if that means that nobody around her feels safe. Like, this is one of the things that happens to some of the crazy anarchists too, is that they believe their rights should go so far as to include essentially inhibiting the rights of others. It's an extremely selfish perspective, and it doesn't even make any fucking sense. Kind of like her identifying as three things that are contradictory to one another.
Genitalia, piece of shit. Trans women are women. How about that? Genitalia does not mean anything about gender, okay? Genitalia does not mean if somebody's sexualizing somebody else's genitalia, that's on them. That's on that woman. They were not threatening her. They were not trying to.
Go about my way.
They're not trying to sexually harass her.
So if you choose to sexually identify somebody else's genitalia, that's on you. Like, what the hell? Okay, so you'll also notice that nobody wants to talk about the children. I guess, is it on the children if they sexualize somebody's genitalia? Is that on them? Again, none of it makes any fucking sense. I'm not even anti-trans, and I cannot wrap my head around this bullshit. This kind of nonsense, especially with Antifa taking up this trash, it just makes Antifa look fucking stupid. Like, this isn't even fighting fascism. This isn't fighting any kind of oppressive force. There was no fascism going on by people coming out to protest against this issue. So basically what it amounts to is that the trans activists in this situation co-opt Antifa and, just to give them an excuse to fucking beat the shit out of people at a spa. And if you watch my earlier video on this, it looks like Antifa created the incident in the first place.
Trans women are women. Come on, let's go. It's not about biology here. Being a woman is not Get out. You're not a woman and you're not trans. So stop speaking for that.
This guy too right here. Get out. Get. Nobody's touching you. Nobody's touching you. Get.
I'm standing right here. I'm allowed to stand here.
Get.
I'm allowed to stand right here.
Get.
Hey, what are you doing? Don't. Hey. You guys gonna do something about this? I'm gonna
Get out. Get my fuck about you. Get out.
I can't tell you how intimidated I would be by somebody in a hot pink wig screaming, "Get out" at me. Don't forget, these are supposed to be the people who are opposing oppression, yet they want to order people around. I again kind of come back to the point that you can't be anti-fascist and be pro-censorship. Censorship is a central function of how fascism maintains its control over people. And I think part of the problem is that these people are now reading critical theory books, and they think that censoring ideas that are against their ideas is somehow protecting them. And if you remember my earlier video when I was talking about Ibram X. Kendi and his unfree speech of trying to redefine what censorship is in the same way that they tried to redefine what racism is, to make it so that, no, this is unfree speech. This isn't free speech because it doesn't agree with me. Human beings cannot be trusted with the power to decide what is allowed to be said and what is not. Just like Derek Jensen said on my recent video with him, if you don't like someone else's book, write a better book. If you don't like somebody else's argument, make a better argument. They're not convincing anybody with this bullshit. And I think that's part of the problem. They know they can't convince anybody because this is an illogical, irrational argument. There's no way to justify this. And I'm getting private messages from other trans people who are saying that this is fucking bullshit because they recognize that this situation is only going to create more problems for trans people. So anyway, I'm going to have a lot more stuff coming out, hopefully a lot of it today. I took a break there for a while because I don't want to get burned out. I want to be able to put out good quality stuff. So this video has been making the rounds, and I thought about just not doing a video for this because so many people have, but I've watched a bunch of them and I noticed that some of them are not making the comments that I would make, making some points that I would have made. So this was a video put out by Myth Informed MKE, which if you have not subscribed to them on Facebook and on Twitter, you really should, because they're honestly proven to be the greatest source as far as raw footage, as far as to critical race theory in schools and etc. So big shout out to them. They put out a lot of great stuff that's just, again, even if, you don't want any spin, you can just kind of watch it for yourself and come to your own conclusions. But in this video, you're basically seeing what's supposed to be a animated race to help us understand critical race theory, which is kind of an ironic play on words. The video is only 2 minutes long, but I think my comments will probably end up being considerably longer because there's a lot of crap in this video. The first thing you're going to notice is as I hit play is that you have two people of color standing here at the finish line, or sorry, the starting line, and then two white people are just going to run by due to wealth disparities. So discrimination can happen for a lot of reasons, and I do believe that there's still some racial discrimination left in this country. So that one's not completely invalid. Let's go on. Okay, so let's take a second to talk about quote-unquote poor schooling. How does poor schooling happen? Some of it does have to do with funding. There's no question. But it doesn't just happen due to funding. And just to be clear, I went to school for most of my life in schools in Ohio and in Michigan that were very low income and predominantly occupied by people of color. And the reality is this, that they're also like not really putting in here. You'll notice that one of the major themes, I guess, in this cartoon is that all of these things happen to the people of color, and that none of it has anything to do with anything that they did or anything that they contributed to the situation. And the reality is this: I went to school in those schools, and nobody there wants an education. I mean, there are very few. And trying to get an education gets you picked on. In fact, going so far as to beat you up. I was jumped by people I didn't even know for using big words. And I was in a session later, with the principal about that. And the kid just flat out said it was because I was using big words. So you couple that with the fact that, the boys grow up wanting to be gangbangers and the girls grow up wanting to date them. That's where your poor schooling is going to come from. If that's the situation you're in, it isn't going to matter where you go to school, and it isn't going to matter how much money you spend on school. If school is not cool, in quotes, kids aren't going to want to do it. And when they get into their neighborhoods and it's easier to sell drugs than it is to get a job, that's what they're going to do. And yes, I know some people are going to say, well, we can, decriminalize drugs. That'll go a step for sure. I definitely advocate for decriminalization. You guys can listen to my interview with the maker of a film on that topic, America's Last Great White Hope. It's a very good interview from my classic days. You can check it out at my channel. But that's not all of it. This issue has to be solved in the schools where it's going on. Going to white schools, quote unquote, and I hate even using that term, and making them all feel like they're white privileged is not going to solve this problem, which is one of the reasons why critical race theory in these schools just doesn't make any sense. It's also, I might add, probably not going to solve the problem in the schools where these issues are actually taking place, because kids are not just going to turn in their homework because you talk to them about how all of their problems actually revolve around white people. Let's continue. Now, one of the problems with the underemployment issue is that, aside from the fact, as I've already pointed out, culturally in the ghettos, they don't want to get a job. It doesn't change the fact that, in addition to that, if there's high crime, nobody wants to invest in a city, especially if you burn it down on a regular basis, which is another one of the reasons why the riots are so fucking stupid. Because a city doesn't recover from a riot usually for about 10 years. There's actual statistics on that, and the LA riots were a perfect example. So if you want people to open up businesses that are going to get you jobs, then stop burning down your cities and clean up the crime. Oh my God. This is one of the biggest pieces of bullshit in this video. First of all, just to get this out of the way, you'll notice that in this video, for some reason, the white people didn't have to take the standardized tests. Everybody takes standardized tests. And to be clear, I'm not the biggest fan of standardized tests. I think that they play a role, but I don't think that they alone are enough. But this kind of comes back to like that stuff that was in the other CRT in colleges video that I did, where they kind of think that what they need to do to make everything equal is just make it easier for kids to pass everything, which unfortunately actually doesn't help anybody. It just basically artificially makes them feel like it helped. There's absolutely no reason why any person of color cannot take and pass a standardized test. And the notion that this is a issue only for people of color only implies to basically a suggestion that somehow people of color are hindered by these tests. It's just bullshit. Everybody takes standardized tests. I took the MEP test in science, and I remember it because I got invited to a pizza party because I did very well, along with everybody else. So this is just on its face, stupid bullshit. Cue the dramatic, sad music. So, this is to suggest that, or rather to equate, going to prison with cages randomly falling out of the sky like something out of a Super Mario game. As if nothing that anybody does leads to them going to prison. As if they are completely absolved of responsibility. And when they describe it as a pipeline, this would be like you walk out of your school and then there's, like a direct line straight to going to prison. As if you go to prison for getting your diploma. And that's not how it works either. One of the things that I realized as I was watching a video about critical race theory is that they don't really want to talk about any of the other causes of these problems. They just want to talk about the white causes of these problems. And if something cannot be directly attributed to them, meaning to white people, then they figure out a way. So here we have an analogy that apparently people go to prison because random cages fall out of the sky and snatch them up. And apparently directly from school. So if you happen to be a person of color and you're getting ready to graduate from high school, make sure you check the weather report for the chances of random cages falling out of the sky. Because I'm pretty sure a meteorologist would probably pick that up. Now, when it comes to housing segregation, redlining used to be a thing. It's illegal now. But one of the things that kind of puzzles me about the way that activism is going nowadays is that they're wanting segregation. They're pushing for segregation. They want, areas that white people are not allowed to go. And there's a reason for that. Also in critical race theory, their own books talk about the idea that we need to racialize everything, make people hyper aware of race, and perhaps provide areas that are just for people of different colors. It literally kind of pushes the idea of segregation. So there's something to this, but it certainly isn't just something that works out the way that they're suggesting in this video. Okay, so this is obviously a direct hit at the Olympic Committee giving drug tests and certain black athletes not making the grade. I want to be clear on something. This is another thing that's kind of bullshit. Everybody takes drug tests. Everybody takes drug tests. As far as how it applies to racial profiling, Oh, and I want to actually, let me clarify. Everybody in the Olympics takes drug tests. All professional athletes take drug tests. It's not that they show up and they find a random black person and say, here, take give me a specimen. It doesn't work like that because they're all mandatory for everyone. And when you're involved in that as an athlete, they actually they have you on a rigid schedule. You got to make sure you turn in, and it's for everybody. You need to be available to them to be tested. But anyway, as far as racial profiling is concerned, one of the most interesting things about racial profiling when you're discussing things with anti-racist people and CRT types is that they have zero problem saying what white people do. White people do this, white people do that, white people did this, white people did that, which is racial profiling. They do it constantly. And another element to this that they're not going to want to discuss, because remember, critical race theory people are not really interested in actual cause and effect. It's easier just to find a scapegoat and stick with that. But racial profiling, while I do not feel is correct, it doesn't just happen. It's not just random. The reason why people of color, unfortunately, and I might add incorrectly, get racially profiled is because of the participation in crime that happens in their communities. If you see the same group of people doing the same thing over and over and over again, eventually people are going to get a profile of you. It happened to me too, because if they figure out that you're poor white trash, they'll follow you around in stores, they'll call the cops on you. I went through all of that as a kid. It only made worse by the fact I was a heavy metal kid, so they all assumed I was on drugs. So I had the long hair and the slashed jeans and all that jazz. So the point is that they're not in any way keeping note of the fact that there are causes of racial profiling. It doesn't make it right, but it's also, for the same reason, not any more right when they do it to white people, but nobody wants to talk about that. Not ready to have that conversation. Racial profiling is only okay if it's done towards white people. That's how they think. There are a lot of factors when it comes to shortened lifespan. One of the people who analyzed this video is actually a black person, and he pointed out that he feels that if anything, it has something to do with diet in that culture. And I hate to admit it, but they cook some pretty fucking awesome food, and a lot of it's not any good for you. I don't know if that's the real truth. I know some of it probably has to do with crime and the fact that a lot of them get murdered. So that's going to shorten your overall lifespan, but this is something I think that can be improved. But again, it's a cultural issue. This is apparently a conveyor belt that's been installed to help white people through connections that apparently black people can't make. So that last part was basically a play on the whole privilege concept. And of course, the white male had to get the most of it. And it again kind of makes it's a racial profiling issue. They're profiling that all white people get these advantages. I didn't get any old boy network help. I didn't get any white privilege help. I'm actually still in the same income bracket that I was when I lived in the ghetto. And the only reason I don't live in the ghetto anymore is because I make personal sacrifices, including not having a bedroom in my own 2-bedroom apartment so that my kids can have them. So again, it's racial profiling to suggest that everybody who is white has privilege. It doesn't take into account the individual circumstances of those people's lives. That's something that people of color want for themselves, at least the activists, and everybody should want to be judged as an individual, not by the color of their skin, by the content of their character. So if we make the suggestion, again, that just some of the absurd things here, don't forget that after you graduate school, watch out for cages randomly falling from the sky to arrest you. You know, be careful about racial profiling. That there's just everything in here was a dramatization, and part of the problems of it is that you know, there's a grain of truth to all of it. But that's how cults operate. They do tell you some good stuff, and they don't really tell you the crazy shit until you've been there for a long time. Thanks for listening. So I decided to start a series that I'm going to call Taking Words Back. And it's basically going to be focused on basically kind of trying to deal with and settle these issues that come up when people kind of try to change the definitions of words to suit themselves and their purposes. There's been an effort for quite some time now in the extreme left part of the sociology department at many universities to rewrite the word, or rather the definition of the word racism. And they suggest that the current definition doesn't suit it properly. And the way that this typically manifests is that to suggest that white people cannot be victims of racism because racism is prejudice plus power. Now, I've been monitoring the definition of racism on various dictionary sites, waiting to see, you know, how much political pressure it would take for them to start to change it, and they still haven't changed the one major fundamental issue, which is this notion that power is required for racism. And so, first of all, let me just read this definition, which, like, even just today I've noticed has more things added to it, but still, they haven't changed it in such a way that would back up the sociological version that they're attempting to create. And note I say sociological version, but it's actually a fringe group in the sociology movement. It's not all of them, but they tried to project themselves as being so. We'll get into that later. But anyway, racism, a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, that the racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. The reason I highlighted this is that it's a belief. Racism is a belief. Now, the reason I bring this up when it comes to the issue of power is that you could believe that if you flap your arms hard enough, you'll be able to fly. You don't have the power to actually fly, but you believe it. Now, while an argument can certainly be made that racism, you know, when being practiced by people who are more powerful is more dangerous, it doesn't mean that powerless people who are racists cease to be racists. And that's why you'll see that nowhere in this definition does it say anything about a requirement to have power. Now, they have packed this with as much stuff to try to placate the extreme left as possible, but there's still nothing like that. The systemic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another, specifically white supremacy. Institutional racism, one of the many ruses racism achieves in the virtual erasure of historical contributions by people of color, or a political or social system founded on racism and designed to execute its principles. So even in this current, recently updated version of the definition, there's nothing in here about power. And the reason why is because, again, it's a belief. Beliefs don't require power. Beliefs require that you think a certain way. And you could be a KKK member who has no limbs, no eyes, no mouth, you know, no power of any kind. You still believe what you believe. And the reason that this becomes dangerous is because activists are going to tell you that unless you have power, you can't be racist. So therefore, you can engage in everything else that goes along with racism and somehow still not be racist. The effect of this has never been in any way something that has helped us defeat racism. Instead, it encourages people of color to behave as racists, which in turn encourages white people to behave as racists in return. It literally has the opposite effect of what you're hoping to achieve. So let's take that definition and apply it to a statement made by a former organizer for Black Lives Matter in Ontario. Definition of racism: a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Whiteness is not humanness. In fact, white skin is subhuman. All phenotypes exist within the Black family, and white people are a genetic defect of Blackness. White people have a higher concentration of enzyme inhibitors that suppress melanin production. They are genetically deficient because melanin is present at the inception of life, melanin is directly linked to fertility and the human reproductive system, melanin is directly linked to strong bones, melanin is directly linked to strength of the nervous system, melanin is directly linked to the strength of senses such as vision and hearing, melanin is directly linked to the strength of neurosystems affecting capacities like intelligence, memory, and creativity. Melanin enables Black skin to capture light and hold it in its memory mode, which reveals that Blackness converts light into knowledge. Melanin directly communicates with cosmic energy. This is why the ingenuity of all humanity comes from Blackness. We are the first and strongest of all humans, and our genetics are the foundation of all humanity. Melanin is essential for the efficient performance of all the body's natural functions. Therefore, white people are recessive genetic defects. This is factual. White people need white supremacy as a mechanism to protect their survival as a people because all they can do is produce themselves. Black people, simply through their dominant genes, can literally wipe out the white race if we had the power to. It is why white supremacy is an important, or as an imperial system thrives. It tries to control, suppress, and destroy our existence in Blackness because we are a threat to the genetic annihilation of white people. Do you ever wonder how Black people, after centuries of colonial violence, genocide, and destruction, no matter what systems are created to make us extinct, how we keep coming back? It's because we are superhumans. So, having read that, let me read this definition one more time. Definition of racism: a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Now, when I read stuff like this, it makes me more or less kind of think of Mein Kampf for Black people, essentially. The suggestion that all of this stuff, I mean, it's obvious racism. But I've been told that because this person doesn't have any power, they're not racist, despite the fact that this literally textbook fits the definition according to the first, chapter, essentially, of the definition of what racism means. So somehow, because this person doesn't have any power, even though they hold these ridiculous beliefs, they can't be racist. That's what is being fed to us as some sort of lie. And I guess one of the other things that occurs to me when people have conversations like this, and there are plenty more disturbing ones that I'll share in a moment, is that at what point are we supposed to go ahead and label them racists? Is it when they don't have any power? Apparently they're not racist, so we don't have to worry about it yet? At what point does it become cause for concern? Because nobody wants to talk about this. The Nazis, for example, were always racist. They didn't just suddenly become racist when Hitler won the election. They were racist before that. But if we were going to follow this logic, then apparently they were not racist until they had power. So at what point are you supposed to do something about that? Is it when they're saying things like this that you should publicly oppose them? Or should you wait until they're actually putting people on, trucks and cars to be shipped off somewhere to be gassed? Is that when they're racist? At what point did the Nazi regime become racist? What was the turning point? People don't usually want to talk about this much longer after I bring that up because they don't have an answer. The only net effect, again, of allowing things like this to go on and say that they're not racist is to, as I said previously, encourage people of color to become racists, which in turn encourages more people who are not of color to become racist. Now let me take a moment to draw a parallel. From the Holocaust Encyclopedia on Nazi Racism, for years before Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, he was obsessed with ideas about race. In his speeches and writings, Hitler spread his beliefs in racial purity and in superiority of the Germanic race, what he called an Aryan master race. He pronounced that his race must remain pure in order to one day take over the world. For Hitler, the ideal Aryan was blonde, blue-eyed, and tall. When Hitler and the Nazis came to power, these beliefs became the government ideology and were spread publicly, displayed posters on the radio, in movies, in classrooms, and in newspapers. The Nazis began to put their ideology into practice with the support of German scientists who believed that the human race could be improved by limiting the reproduction of people considered to be inferior. Hitler and other Nazi leaders viewed the Jews not as a religious group, but as a poisonous race, which lived off other races and weakened them. After Hitler took power, Nazi teachers in school classrooms began to apply the principles of racial science. Think about that.
And I'm going to go out of bounds with what I have to say relative to what we've been talking about, because we understood that we were in a war, and I want to emphasize that to you. We are in a war. I taught on the college level for a number of years at a so-called black college, and I'm down against black colleges. I'm going to tell you straight up, because some of the madness that's going on in these schools. The other thing is that there's only one nigger on the planet. I never use that word. This is the first time I've used it. I don't even think that word, but there's only one nigger on the planet. And the nigger that's on the planet is the one that is destroying the water, the one that's polluting the air, the one that is exploiting people and resources. And the only nigger on the planet is the white man and the white woman. And then finally, I want to say that we need one idea. And we're not thinking about a solution to the problem. We're dealing with all these other things, but these are diversions from the solution to the problem. And we have to start to think about a solution to the problem so that these young brothers and sisters who are here now, who are 15, 16, and 17, are not here 25 years later talking about these same problems. Now, how do I know that the white people know that we are going to come up with a solution to the problem? I know it because they have retina scans, they have what they call racial profiling, DNA banks, and they're monitoring our people to try to prevent the one person from coming up with the one idea. And the one idea is how we are going to exterminate white people, because that, in my estimation, is the only conclusion I have come to. We have to exterminate white people off of the face of the planet to solve this problem. Now, I don't care whether you clap or not, but I'm saying to you that we need to solve this problem because they are going to kill us. And I will leave on that. So we have to just set up our own system and stop playing and get very serious and not be diverted from coming up with a solution to the problem. And the problem on the planet is white people.
Be hard to follow that one. You can get as black as you want. I don't know if you can get that.
By conquering the East, the Nazis had vastly increased the number of people from so-called inferior races under their control, all to be made to suffer by the German master race. The Gypsies of Hungary and Romania, the Slavs, and the Jews of Eastern Europe. 3 million in Poland, 4.5 million in Russia. Ghettos were one solution, but by the end of 1941, another final solution had begun: the mass murder of the Jews of Europe.
So now I've got to ask, when does this man become racist? Is it when he's suggesting these things, or is it when he can actually do these things? If we were to go with the prejudice plus power idea, then I guess technically, by that ridiculous idea, he's not racist. Even when he's calling for genocide, he's not racist. So, let me again submit to you that the only net benefit of suggesting that a man can call for genocide of an entire race as his final solution is not racism. The only benefit of making that the case is to allow something like this idea to rise to power. There's literally no other benefit to this. Because if we were still allowed to call people of color racists, then we could call this out for what it is. But instead, there's this new gray area of, well, if you're one of the approved list of oppressed people, then you're allowed to talk like that. And again, doesn't make any sense. And I acknowledge that there are systemic issues that should be talked about. Like I said earlier, we can discuss that racists who have more power are certainly more dangerous. But again, it's a belief. It's not the power to do anything about that belief. It's a belief. And it's an incorrect belief. It's an ignorant belief. You know, I thought the whole point behind all of this was to call out behavior wherein somebody is apparently, supposedly on the hook for or responsible for everything that has ever been done by people who look a certain way or, you know, are part of a certain group. I thought that's what was the problem. But now we have a situation where there's one class of people that has the privilege to engage in racism and bigotry and calling for genocide. So with that said, I decided perhaps we should end this video with words from a different black intellectual. You may have heard of him.
Will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
This bill of comprehensive police reform to be... just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us, excuse us. It sounds like gunshots. I'll let you know what this is. These seem to be gunshots. Shit. Shit, where is that?
We're okay, we're okay, we're okay.
We're just going to go.
So that was the scene today at the George Floyd Memorial. Tragically, ironically, a gangland shootout, you know, right at the site where people are honoring the memory of George Floyd on the anniversary of his death. Unfortunately, while this particular incident might get a little more attention because it's on the anniversary, it is part of a pattern of increased violence that has been taking place in that autonomous zone where the police are not allowed to be. This would go back to the defunding and abolishing the police doesn't seem to actually address the problems that take place, in regards to crime. So I took this clip here, especially because this is the concerns of a couple of Black business owners who live in the area who are having problems with their business because of the lack of police presence and the increase in violence. This was actually done on March 9th, 2021.
Area where George Floyd died. Over the weekend, a man was shot in the nearby Uptown neighborhood, and a man died after being shot at 38th Street and Chicago Avenue. Reg Chapman has more from business owners at 38th in Chicago who are concerned about customer safety and a lack of resources to stay afloat.
After the incident that claimed George Floyd's life, 38th in Chicago has become known across the globe as a place of healing. Peace and respect are requirements to enter, but something has changed lately.
They don't feel safe. People are selling their homes. They hear gunshots. The police, they know the police not coming into the neighborhood.
Sam Willis owns Just Turkey. Willie Frazier owns Finished Touch Boutique, both businesses within feet of where George Floyd took his last breath, both now suffering from lack of customers because of the violence.
It can happen anytime. Yesterday, like you mentioned, it was 1 o'clock in the afternoon, over 20 shots fired. Lady and her 3 children ran into my restaurant.
2 of my customers had to get down on the ground yesterday because of gunfire.
The Free State of George Floyd is surrounded by barricades that these business owners believe protect the people who are doing wrong.
Well, they got the street closed off yet. They defined it. The police can't come in there. So whatever wrongdoing they did out here, outside the zone, once they make it to the zone, they're free. Police can't get them.
Minneapolis police have responded to incidents inside the zone and say it will continue to patrol the area in hopes of stopping the gunfire. Both Frazier and Willis want more to be done to protect lives and bring business back to the area.
You get shot in the zone, ambulance can't come in there. Nobody can come in there and get you. So I don't know if a building burned down, I don't know if they let a fire truck in there. They might let it burn down to the ground.
We know this is a prime location. You have visitors coming all across the world, and for them to experience gunshots and all type of violence is putting a black eye not only on our state, but let alone the city of Minneapolis.
So far, no financial help from the city. Both men feel abandoned by. Reg Chapman, WCCO 4 News.
So again, I thought anyway that supposedly removing police from the situation is supposed to make it more safe. I don't know who it makes it safer for, unless you're referring to the criminals who are now having an easier time of having shootouts. There was 2 articles that I looked at about this, and where George Floyd was killed. This is in the New York Times. Solemn by day and violent by night. This apparently does not take into account the broad daylight gunfight that we just watched. But this was all the way back from July 29th, 2020. And basically 2 months after the police killing of George Floyd, the 4-block area of South Minneapolis, where he gasped his last breaths, remains a sacred space, a no-go zone for officers. There is a neatly trimmed garden anchored by a sculpture of a raised fist. There are colorful murals and the words "I can't breathe" painted across the pavement, as well as the names of the dozens of other Black people killed by police. At night, though, the space is increasingly a battleground with shootings and drug overdoses. The area has had an uptick in gun violence similar to what other cities have seen in the wake of protests. At all times, the neighborhood brims with emotion. In its totality, it feels like the raw center of America's reckoning with racial injustice. The chaos at night has presented city officials with the challenge of how to reassert control of the space without setting off new waves of anger, all while maintaining it as a solemn place to honor Mr. Floyd in Ferguson, where the police killing of Michael Brown set off protests when officers moved to clear out a memorial. So basically, they're trying to avoid protesters trying to fight them about taking it down. But in Minneapolis, at least for now, the city is moving cautiously. So it says, even so, elected officials are fielding a growing number of calls from residents concerned about the violence and loud noise at night in the area, where among several incidents, a pregnant woman was recently killed. Actually, we'll This is a short article, so we'll zoom over to that, but this is the one that was linked here in the Star Tribune. Pregnant woman fatally shot in South Minneapolis. Baby delivered. A pregnant woman was shot Sunday night in South Minneapolis. This was on July 6th, and died after being rushed to a hospital. The woman's baby was delivered at HCMC and placed in the neonatal intensive care unit. There was no word in the newborn's condition, according to the police spokesman. Shots were heard about 9:15 p.m. near the intersection of East 37th Street and South Elliott Avenue. Officers found the woman inside a vehicle suffering from an apparent gunshot wound. Police have classified the woman's death as a homicide. No one has been arrested. So, coming back to here, what people aren't recognizing is that people who live there are having a very, very challenging time from the unlawfulness that is occurring after the sun goes down, or now, as I pointed out earlier, apparently also in broad daylight, said Andrea Jenkins, a member of the city council whose district includes the memorial space. Mind you, this is the same city council that voted to defund the police and then voted to refund the police and had the gall to complain about the increase in crime that happened around that time, including like carjackings and such that all skyrocketed. But anyway, there are constant gunshots every night. Emergency vehicles can't get in. Disabled people are not able to access their medications, their appointments, their food deliveries, etc. It's a very challenging situation. Ms. Jenkins, who noted that the area has historically been plagued by gang violence, has also been taking a leading role in discussions over how to memorialize Mr. Floyd's killing. One proposal suggests making the garden permanent. Other ideas include a civil rights museum and renaming Chicago Avenue in honor of Mr. Floyd. So I guess, looking over all of this, it really just kind of comes down to the fact that you guys didn't want any police there. Now you have no police there. What is it exactly that you're trying to make safer? It comes back, like what I said earlier. How are you making your community safer by removing the police from it? They're safe from being, the possibility of the numbers actually say that only about 1,000 people are killed by police in a given year out of over 3,500,000 police interactions. So you've made people safer from the possibility that they may be one of those 1,000 people, which is an average number that I might add is not basically adjusted for any kind of legitimate shootings. That's just the overall number. So statistically, you are more likely to drown in a swimming pool, die in a house fire, or die in childbirth than you are being killed by a policeman. Criminals, at least from one of the statistics I found, usually kill about 24,000 a year. Obviously not the priority, though, for some reason. But anyway, she says the daytime is fine. Once again, this is a while ago. But when the other crowd comes at night, I can't call the police, and that scares the hell out of me. We have kids in this home, and I do want police to protect families. It's a hard balance. I'm happy this incident brought change, but I want to feel safe. So, they basically go on to kind of describe that, that it was better during the daylight, but obviously that's changed now. And it says here, actually, I guess we'll read this too. Sunset to sundown is very different from sundown to sunset. My nighttime world after sunset, I have taken care of double gunshot wounds, drug overdoses. One night, a man wounded by gunfire drove a bicycle past the barricade, she said, before collapsing outside her tent and yelling, "I'm shot, I'm shot." After the pregnant woman was killed nearby in early July and having dodged gunfire herself, Dr. Kowecki limited the hours of her medic station from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. But residents say that nothing happening at night diminishes the atmosphere that prevails in the daylight. Again, yeah, it's not working out like that anymore. This is the space where the community members want to decentralize white feelings and prioritize black pain. Okay, so you decentralized white feelings and you're prioritizing black pain by providing a space where people of color can more easily get away with shooting one another. Well done. I think it's important that white people are intentional with the ways they are using this space. So, to wrap this up, I guess to those of you who, again, want to defund and abolish the police department, I've yet to hear any kind of solutions that are going to solve this problem. You can, I don't see, for example, social workers being called to the scene of a shooting. I understand the concept behind, trying to create more social programs to cut out poverty, which is at its root the cause of, most of the crime problems, when you dig very down to the deep root of the issue. But you can look at the root causes of something without looking at the trunk of the tree. Because if we cut out the root, the trunk, the tree is going to fall. And if you haven't figured out the solution on how to deal with the tree, you can't be dealing, playing around with the roots. That's basically where we're at, and until you change the culture that venerates the idea that people of color should shoot one another over trivial things like dissing one another, you're going to continue to have these problems. There has to be a cultural change that goes hand in hand with the things that you're doing, because and there's never any activism about that. Nobody wants to spend any time trying to put any social pressure on anybody to overcome the culture that goes on in the ghetto. And I say that as somebody who grew up there. This is not something that I'm not just some white guy who never experienced it. I heard gunshots on a regular basis where I grew up, and my neighbor's house turned into a crack house during the time that I was there. So, but where I went to school, these kinds of problems, were essentially encouraged by the culture of the people who lived there. Getting good grades, getting a job, these things were things that kids could actually be picked on, if not beat up for doing. Hell, using large words, like just having a high vocabulary, was a reason to get beat up. And until you address that problem, no amount of throwing money at the issue and no amount of removing police from the issue is going to solve this one. Thanks for listening. Earlier this month, a comedian named Paul Mooney passed away on May 19th. Mr. Mooney basically had a long history of controversial comedy that usually kind of revolved around making disparaging comments about white people, the comments that are supposedly not racist.
I can't be racist by definition. Look that up in the white folks dictionary. How can I be racist?
Well, I couldn't find the white folks dictionary, so I guess we're going to have to settle for the real dictionary. But let's go ahead and get into this again. Racism. A belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Also, behavior or attitudes that reflect and foster this belief, racial discrimination or prejudice. Now, this is interesting because a lot of the people who say that black people can't be racist do say that black people can be prejudiced, but the definition of racism makes it clear that being racially prejudiced is still racism. The systemic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another, a political or social system founded on racism and designed to execute its principles. So that's the actual definition in the dictionary that he suggested that we look it up in. But let's see, because he elaborates a little bit on his own criteria for racism.
I've never told anyone where to live. I've never told anyone what kind of jobs to have. I've never kept anyone from going to a school, out of a restaurant, or drinking from a fountain. I've never lynched anybody. So how can I be racist? How can I be racist? By definition, I can't be racist.
All right, so let's go down this checklist that Mr. Mooney put together to ensure that even I myself could not possibly be racist, because I've never told anyone where they can live, check, what kind of job they can have, check, nor have I ever prevented anybody from going to a school, check, going to a restaurant, check, using a drinking fountain, check, and I've never lynched anybody. Therefore, I cannot be racist.
I think what's happening is
How can the slave be the master? That doesn't even make sense. I mean, that's someone that's telling you this or making that statement, whether they're black or white. They have to be totally insane. I can't be by definition. Look up the definition of racism.
Well, let's go back to it. Because before I wasn't sure, but now that I've read his checklist, I know for sure. Actually, I think what he was probably getting at was to suggest that he can't be racist because he doesn't have the power to do any of those things. But once again, we're going back to what he said. Look up the definition of racism, and here we have it. Not only is his criteria not in here, the suggestion that people have to have the power to do any of those things to be racist is also not in here, because that's not the definition of racism. Thanks for listening. Up. They're not even in the same category. And, when what ended up coming out of this, however, so having taken a brief break from this issue about what's going on in the social sciences, I decided to go ahead and basically do a show specifically talking about the greater crisis in psychology and sociology that has been going on for some time now. And this actually came to my attention a little while ago. And when you think about the implications of it, it's actually rather disturbing. Psychology is considered to be a major science along with sociology. And I do think that they're sciences, and I think that they're important. And they're also very powerful. A lot of laws are passed based on the studies of psychologists and sociologists. For example, laws about parenting and the issues of trans rights, all of that, all involve psychology and sociology in some way. Critical race theory in schools, once again, critical race theory comes out of the sociology department. So first I wanted to talk generically about the problem in general that is going on in the social sciences, and it's the replication crisis. For those of you who don't know, the scientific method basically involves several phases. And one of the major phases is the aspect that any experiment that you do to establish a finding has to be replicatable by somebody else. And if it's not, then that generally is supposed to mean that you just toss it out. It's like, well, if we can't prove it, then it could have just been a fluke. To be somewhat fair to the scientists involved, it's very difficult, particularly when you're talking about studies involving things that are considered immoral. Like, obviously, you can't conduct a test where you hit somebody over the head every day and then determine if it changes them psychologically. But this also leaves the door open for people with a agenda to abuse the system, which is exactly what's going on. Now, first I'm going to read from this article from Psychology Today, specifically about the replication crisis. The replication crisis in psychology refers to concerns about the credibility of findings in psychological science. The term, which originated in the early 2010s, denotes that findings in behavioral science often cannot be replicated. Researchers do not obtain results comparable to the original peer-reviewed study when repeating that study using similar procedures. For this reason, many scientists question the accuracy of published findings and now call for increased scrutiny of research practices in psychology. What led to the replication crisis in psychology? Some scientists have warned for years that certain ways of collecting, analyzing, and reporting data, often referred to as questionable research practices, make it more likely that results will appear to be statistically meaningful, even though they are not. Flawed study designs and a publication bias that favors confirmatory results are other long-time sources of concern. Basically, if there's anybody out there that really wants to believe that something is true, and more importantly, wants other people to believe that it's true, then it basically benefits the psychologist or sociologist to try to publish findings that confirm that. Confirmation bias is supposed to be one of the critical things that is avoided in science. The idea that I have something that I believe is true, therefore I go out into the world and try to find ways to prove it. It's usually attached directly to people who have some kind of emotional attachment to a point of view. Especially when you're talking about things that are politically motivated, this effect is unfortunately almost inevitable, but a good scientist is supposed to be able to discipline themselves to stop it. Anyway, going back to the article, a series of replication projects in the mid-2010s amplified these worries. In one major project, fewer than half of the studies that replicators tried to recreate yielded similar results, suggesting that at least some of the original findings were false positives. A variety of findings have come into question following the replication attempts, including well-known ones suggesting that certain types of priming and physical poses and other simple interventions could affect behavior in surprising or beneficial ways. It is important to note that psychology is not alone. However, other fields, such as cancer research and economics, have faced similar questions about methodological rigor. The growing awareness of how research practices can lead to false positives has coincided with the extreme instances of willful misrepresentation and falsification, resulting in some cases in the removal or resignation of prominent scientists. When did the replication crisis start? The field of psychology began to reckon with reproducibility around 2010, when a particularly dubious paper claimed that to provide evidence of precognition, or the ability to perceive events in the future. Scientists increasingly began to discuss methodological concerns and to repeat experiments to corroborate published studies. The failure to consistently replicate those findings propelled the movement forward. What research practices have led to unreliable results? Journals have incentivized to publish interesting and surprising findings. This leads to publication bias, the tendency to publish positive findings rather than studies that find no effect. Researchers are incentivized to publish as often as possible to advance their careers. Therefore, they may exercise flexibility in their data analysis to achieve statistical significance. Let's consider for a moment this issue about advancing careers. There's a lot of money to be made in this regard. It's hard to forget this, but if there's a profit motive, something is always going to be tinged so far as, with what can make money. So for a researcher, many of these people basically make their entire living based on the grants that they get. That's how they pay their bills, in addition to paying for their research. So if nobody's interested in researching a given topic, you're going to have a hard time finding, money to research that topic. And more importantly, if somebody has a vested interest in the research of a topic going a certain way, then they're going to be financially obligated, or not obligated, but incentivized to only pay for research that they kind of have a wink-wink understanding is going to come out the way they wanted. So, anyway, therefore, they may exercise flexibility in their data analysis to achieve statistical significance. There's a lot of different little pieces to this, but one of the other articles that I pulled up on this describes what are the possible explanations for the replication crisis, which would be a widespread lack of methodological sophistication, with researchers using poorly designed experiments with small sample sizes and inappropriate statistical models. An example of this that comes to mind for me is when I did the research that I did for the trans athletes in sports study. One of the studies that was quoted constantly by trans activists only had I think it was like 8 people were tested. So that's a pretty small sample size. Anyway, the publish or perish economic model of universities, which provides an economic incentive for researchers to publish work showing effects. Clerical errors in reporting and programming, and fraud, with research being invented to further career interests or the interests of organizations sponsoring the research. So, speaking of fraud, I'm now going to bring up an article about 3 individual activists who decided to test this last theory, specifically because they had noticed a troubling bias and agenda in the social sciences. So some of you may have already heard about this, and if you have, great. If you haven't, I urge you to check it out, because the implications for this, particularly when it comes to things like critical race theory or the insane behavior of the 2 psychiatrists that I just dealt with in previous videos and their papers identifying whiteness as a disease, that they feel they can treat. These three activists submitted false papers, as in just basically created stuff out of thin air, and submitted them to see what it would take to be able to get them published. And the details of which included things like rewriting a chapter of Mein Kampf, meaning Hitler's book, and changing out the word Jew for the word man. And that one was accepted and published. Publishing a fake study that suggests that dog humping in dog parks was proof of the patriarchy, and more specifically, rape culture. There was another study where they suggested, to the journals that they were, basically asking to peer review their studies. What if we chained white people to the floor in college campuses as kind of a test for reparations? These are the different things that came out of their studies. And one of the things that they noticed as they went through the process was that when they were being critiqued, it was generally almost always in the direction of being even more woke, even more extreme. And they were able to publish a lot of articles, and they were able to do it by, they didn't conduct any studies. They didn't go to any dog parks to observe people to determine if there was a rape culture in dog parks. They didn't do any of those things. Yet they were all basically approved. And if you think very hard about this, that means that the implications of it are that a lot of the things that are currently being peddled on college campuses as having come from actual studies are bullshit. One of the things that came up when I watched these three being interviewed by Jordan Peterson was that they pointed out that, they would accept all kinds of different articles because then they can cite those articles anytime they need to when they're conducting debates to support their agenda. So if you write an article that they can later cite when they're debating on what should go into textbooks or when they're debating with politicians, they could say, well, peer-reviewed studies have said, and as long as it basically fits the woke agenda perfectly, then it's in their best interest to go ahead and let that through. And they know also that most people never look up someone's sources. Like, I guarantee even the people who didn't agree with the last, few videos that I just did probably didn't bother to look up the sources that I provided, but that same thing goes, if you're debating, say, Ben Shapiro on stage over something involving critical race theory and you cite studies, nobody's going to go bother to look those up. They'll just say, oh, well, they said there's peer-reviewed studies and that's good enough. So there's an incentive for people with an agenda to approve, papers that really have no reason to be approved. And they're not bothering to test the methods. They're not bothering to see the data. They're not, if it goes along with, what they want it to say, what they want it to mean, then they're just going to put a stamp on it and send it through. Now, this at first just sounds like an egg-headed problem that maybe shouldn't bother anybody outside of academia, but there's an excellent example that comes to mind of when studies like these are conducted by people with, an agenda, and then it affects laws, being written. It affects the way that universities conduct themselves, the kinds of things that end up being taught to our children. And one of them happened to be the debate on spanking. So I'm going to go to an article about that topic. So I want to make something clear. I'm not bringing this up to try to propose a pro or anti-spanking perspective. But this article in Science News, is one that I tend to bring up when people say that the science is already settled on the issue of spanking. And the reality is that there's actually not very much science on this topic. Just like there really isn't really very much science on the trans issue in sports. There's a lot of other things that people are, that are saying the science is in and this is what it says, when it's not. Opponents, meaning of spanking, often point to scientific studies as proof that spanking is bad. And I confess, I originally thought this post was going to describe those results that we've all heard. How children who have been spanked are more aggressive and have more behavioral problems. But despite the headlines, the science behind spanking is actually quite limited, says clinical psychologist Christopher Ferguson of Stetson University in DeLon, Florida. Because it's a culture war issue. I think a lot of what we hear was misrepresented and what is very nuanced science. For instance, a large analysis of 88 corporal punishment studies found that children who were physically punished were more likely to be aggressive, show antisocial behavior, and have lower mental health. In that analysis, violent actions including punching, kicking, and burning were excluded from the analysis, but face slapping, beating, and hitting so hard as to cause bruises of cuts were included, making it hard to tease out the effect of gentler swats on the bum. Now, the reason that this is relevant in particular, and I'll show you one of the articles in question, is that these studies basically took the data of kids who were gently swatted on the bum or just periodically spanked and threw that data in with kids who were beaten and hit so hard so as to cause bruises or cuts. There's no way, there's no other science that you could get away with doing that, where you put two data sets that are just drastically different from one another in and say, see, now because of this, we know this. Imagine if you were an engineering, professor or basically researcher, and you decided to throw the tensile strength results of aluminum in with titanium. You could never do that. And there's definitely a drastic difference between occasionally paddling somebody and beating them and hitting them hard enough to cause bruises or cuts. Those are not even close to the same thing. And again, this isn't about spanking or no spanking. I'm not getting into that argument right now. The point is that you can't include these things like, bruises and cuts, slapping, that's, with the same thing as just like the more typical spanking that I would say, sane parents practiced when I was growing up. They're not even in the same category. And, what ended up coming out of this, however, this commonly, put up study, was that they would say the science is in all spanking causes mental health issues, violence, drug addiction, and the whole 9 yards. And again, they present this as if the science is already settled. So articles like this get circulated everywhere. The science is in, spanking children does serious long-term damage. Basically, again, just referring to it as if this is what the science says, the science is established, as if there's no questions to be asked, as if all of the studies that were conducted about it were done with the correct level of scientific vigor. And I hate to say it, but I'm kind of skeptical. In fact, at this point, I'm kind of skeptical what any kind of social scientists say. If people are interested in my actual views about the science of spanking, I can bring them up in another channel or another video. But the main reason I brought this up was just to use it as an example of the way that things are presented as if they're already settled in science when they're not. It's the same stuff that the critical race theory types try to do when they say things like, well, no, the definition of racism has changed. My sociology professor told me that, when it still hasn't changed at all in any credible dictionary. But it makes you wonder, when you think back to the article that I brought up earlier, how many other articles, have gone through that are still, in circulation, in publication, and being used to write, the textbooks were basically people just making it up. How many more of them had, used bad study, basically bad research practices in order to achieve the result that they wanted, to fit whatever agenda that they wanted. And this is a serious issue because, again, we use psychology and sociology to kind of try to help us determine reality. And in particular, to try to help us determine who is healthy in their ability to perceive and understand reality. And if we don't have this down, if we can just simply make up articles that suggest that, taking a chapter of Mein Kampf and rewriting it to say men as a feminist piece is a legitimate way of arguing, it throws a black eye into the whole situation. And when you take this into account with the stuff that is now being circulated, like the article I just read from the guy who said that whiteness is a parasitic, mental condition that he thinks he can treat, or Kalani, Aruna Kalani, the doctor at Yale, just spouting off that white people do this and white people do that. Like, that was supposed to be an educational lecture, and she didn't really say anything. If she published a paper saying that stuff, well, then all of a sudden people would be citing her paper as evidence that all white people are this and all white people are that. And then apparently they don't eat bread because of guilt over colonialism. If you haven't watched my videos on that, I'll actually probably just stick them in the cards next to this one. But I did a 3-part series on Kalani, and I did a show about the other fellow who wrote the article about whiteness being a parasitic condition. So when people tell you that the science says this or the science says that, particularly about the social studies, when you consider some of the damage that could be done to society as a whole, I mean, it just do the research yourself. And I don't mean you have to go out and actually conduct the research, but look into the methodology, like I did for the spanking issue. When they took the data sets of this is how kids behaved when they've been paddled and stuck them in with people who've been beaten bloody, and there's no way you could ever get away with that in any other science. And an excellent example of how this manifests in critical race theory is something that I'll show next. So some time ago, this could be found on the Smithsonian website for the African American History Museum, and it was called White Culture in the United States. And some of the things that were identified on here as whiteness kind of disturbed me. For example, emphasis on the scientific method was listed as an aspect of being white. Objective, rational, linear thinking, cause and effect relationships, quantitative emphasis. Now, one of the other things I've noticed is that some of the critical race theory types say things like there is no objective truth. And thinking that there is objective truth is faulty. So in other words, nothing is true, necessarily. And they want to get away from the scientific method. Now, who would have a motive to try to de-emphasize the scientific method or rational linear thinking? When there was a witch hunt going on at the Evergreen State College, which there's a great documentary you can watch about, but basically they identified a white professor, suggested he was racist, and went on like an inquisition. At one point, the professor asked to speak to one of the students, and the student literally said, "No, you'll just use your logic and reason on me." Like the professor would have casted a spell on him. And I'm not paraphrasing, that's what the kid said, because he was told to be afraid of rational linear thinking, because that's whiteness, of course. There are other things on here that, I would say are questionable, but that was the one that's more or less relevant to what I'm suggesting, right now, is that somebody has, an agenda where they feel it's in our best interest to stop emphasizing the scientific method or rational thinking. And needless to say, I feel that's pretty damn dangerous. And the only kind of people that would benefit from de-emphasizing the scientific method are the kind of people who want to be able to publish bullshit science to push their agenda. So that's what I got for you today, folks. Please do me a favor and leave comments, like and subscribe. Hello, everyone. This particular episode is directed particularly at the right-leaning conservative element of my audience. However, the left-leaning part of my audience will also find it useful. I want to talk specifically about the efforts of communists to undermine and demoralize the United States, and the part of this story that is not spoken enough about. A lot of effort is justifiably being made to call out the efforts in academia to radicalize people into far-left communist beliefs. However, this is only part of the equation. First, let me share with you a clip of Yuri Bezmenov, the Soviet defector who came to the United States to warn us of communist efforts to undermine our nation's sense of identity, demoralize and destabilize our society as part of an effort to eventually destroy the United States using methods the Soviets had used in other countries. This clip is part of a much larger presentation that I will be going into more depth about later. However, conservatives in particular need to consider the presence of bad actors within the United States who are unwittingly helping this process of demoralization. Let's take a look.
If we are talking about capitalists or wealthy businessmen, I think they are selling the rope on which they will hang very soon. If they don't stop, if they cannot curb their unsettled desire for profit, and if they keep on trading with the monster of the Soviet communism, they are going to hang very soon. And they will pray to be killed, but unfortunately they will be sent to Alaska probably to manage industry of slaves. It's simplistic. I know it sounds unpleasant. I know Americans don't like to listen to things which are unpleasant. But I have defected not to tell you the stories about such idiocy as microfilm, James Bond type espionage. This is garbage. You don't need any espionage anymore. I have come to talk about survival. It's a question of survival of this system.
So let's consider for a moment what he is talking about. Conservatives are correct to heed Yuri's warnings about communist efforts to undermine our system. But the group that Yuri is calling out here plays a major role in the plans of the communists. Note, obviously at this point we would swap out Soviet Russia for communist China so far as who is the likely culprit when it comes to manipulating the situation. But now we are going to talk about the role that the super wealthy play in this situation. As Yuri pointed out, the wealthy are selling the rope they will be hung with. Our economy has largely been sold to communist China. They continue to grow stronger while we grow weaker. One of the things the early part of the pandemic showed us was our dependence on China for much of our manufacturing. But what Yuri specifically is talking about is the obsession with profits from the top 1%, the same group that the Occupy Wall Street movement was trying to draw attention to. Now, a lot of efforts are put into telling conservatives to blame these people, or maybe these people, with our current economic situation. Basically, a lot of emphasis is placed on addressing the entitlements in our system and that how apparently the real leeches on our economy are the super poor. But you will notice that very little, if any, attention is given to these people and their role specifically in undermining our economic situation and creating a situation where capitalism doesn't work for everybody. And this is just one aspect of it. I'm going to get into more of it later. But Walmart specifically did a lot to destroy the middle class. And we look at the cheap stuff that we're buying and we think to ourselves, you know, this is great. This is capitalism working. Our prices are going down. But in order to get those prices, they created a situation where we've shut down our manufacturing and we're outsourcing it to places where people basically live not much better than plantation slaves in many cases to make our goods, something that people in the United States are not willing to do for obvious reasons that people who are in those countries can be forced to do through poverty. So this chart shows the U.S. jobs displaced by the growing goods trade deficit with China since 2001 in thousands of jobs. Where does this trade deficit come from? Well, basically, we have closed down our manufacturing and we've moved it to China and places like China, and the jobs go with them. And this creates lower prices in places like Walmart, but it also destroys the local middle class because they can't find good paying jobs anymore. And if they own their own businesses, their businesses are undermined. Now, whose fault is this? This obviously isn't something that the welfare people are putting together. This is something that the corporate welfare people are putting together. The top 1% play a huge role in this situation that is often ignored. Now, some efforts are, pushed by the conservative media to get you to blame these people. And these are the people who work in the sweatshops overseas, the places where our jobs went. Many of them live in circumstances that are not really that different than the plantation slaves that we used to have in the United States. But again, nobody's talking about who sent the jobs over there, and their role in the situation. Now, organized labor in the United States did an awful lot to prevent circumstances like this from existing within the United States. And that used to be enough. But now, due to advents in shipping technology, you can make your entire workforce in manufacturing look much like this and take them out of situations where they live like this. The super wealthy want situations where they have their boot on your throat, because that puts them in a circumstance of maximized profits, maximized power over you, the worker. Now, this chart shows where the jobs are going. US-based multinational companies added jobs overseas during the 2000s and cut them at home. Cumulative change since 1999. As you can see, the up is all on the side of jobs outside the US. The down is on the side of jobs, in the US. And this trend just continued. It was facilitated by changes in our economic structure in the United States and in our laws that were put together in a bipartisan fashion. More on that later. Here's another graph that shows the effects of outsourcing on our economy. As you can see, it hurts American workers a hell of a lot more than it helps them in most of the categories presented. Now, another culprit that is frequently brought up when it comes to the issues of our economy and people leeching off of it, and specifically about why we may have difficulty finding a job in circumstances of economic difficulty, would be the illegal immigrants, or the undocumented workers, as the left has been manipulated to call them. And a lot of effort is put on to suggesting the solutions to this would basically just make it harder for illegal immigrants to get into the country, put up a wall, et cetera, et cetera. But have you ever noticed that the root cause of this situation never receives any kind of attention on the part of the right-wing media? And who are they? Why is it that nobody ever talks about the employers of illegal immigrants? Why is no attention ever given to their role in the situation? Why are there never any, Fox News pundits or whatever calling for this problem to be addressed? And I think the answer to the question has to do with the fact that your media, both right and left, is owned by corporations, and that they're more interested in getting the middle class to blame the poor, whether it's immigrants, or welfare moms, for all of their problems. And that's the reason why, as you can see, criminal prosecutions against employers are rare. The overall data shows that criminal prosecutions of employers who knowingly hire undocumented workers are rare, and most that are convicted receive little more than token punishment. So why is this? Why isn't this aspect of it ever addressed? Why are we just talking about building walls and, increasing border control, which I'm not saying could not be a solution if this is what you think is the problem with the economy. But wouldn't it be easier to simply prosecute the people that are doing it over here? It would be easier, but it wouldn't be convenient for the people who actually own your government. And that would be those top 1% types I was talking about earlier. Consider for a moment the game here that they are playing. Again, you are being told as the middle class conservatives that all of your problems would go away if we just dealt with anybody other than the 1% who created those problems. Now, if you have been conditioned into traditional thinking so far as politics, you will find yourself trying to rationalize a way as to how this situation was obviously created by the other tribe. The truth is, this situation was orchestrated with efforts from both of the major political parties, and this truth exposes a reality that people often don't consider. That truth is that there really is only one party. The party that Yuri was mentioning is playing a major role in helping the communists undermine our economy and our way of life. The super wealthy. It was both Reaganomics and NAFTA that brought us to the situation that we are currently in, that is making capitalism only work for some people in this country. Now, honest capitalists will admit that this is an issue. Free market capitalists will say that this is a perfect reason to simply remove government intervention, as the system that is supposed to protect us from white-collar crime is clearly corrupt. This, to me, comes off as basically the conservative version of abolish the police. Basically, it is naive to assume that because some cops are corrupt that we don't need cops. It is equally naive to assume that because some government regulators are corrupt, we should do away with government agencies that seek to protect the people and simply rely on the goodwill of wealthy people to not behave immorally. So let's take a moment to reflect on the history of the situation and how both sides contributed to the circumstances that we are in right now. Reaganomics, a historical watershed. The socio-economic impact of Reaganomics and its long-run deleterious legacy is documented. The preponderance of data indicate that economic growth was not particularly impressive in the wake of the tax cuts of 1981 or 1986. GDP did snap back to potential, but failed to accelerate beyond the rates achieved in prior or subsequent decades. The supposed incentives of supply-side economics failed to materialize. People did not work more, they did not save or invest more than they did before, and the benefits trickled down like molasses and got stuck at the very top of the income distribution. Instead, Reagan's presidency was a watershed in the U.S. economic development in the sense that it reversed many of the accomplishments of the New Deal and inaugurated an era in which low-skilled men's wages began a long period of decline and labor's share of GDP continued to fall. Reagan's true legacy is a dual economy that accompanied the hollowing out of the middle class, a more business-friendly regulatory and oversight framework for Wall Street that ultimately led to the financial crisis, a stupendous increase in the national debt from 30% to 50% of the GDP that put it on a path such that by 2012 it exceeded 100%. Anti-statism that contributed to the rise of Trumpism, a remarkable rise in inequality that gave rise to an oligarchy, and the benign neglect of blue-collar workers who eventually became Hillary Clinton's deplorables. Reagan put the economy on a trajectory to ultimately, even if not inevitably, led to the triumph of Trumpism and an economy of malaise. Now, to those of you who are my followers who obviously are Trumpers, don't take too much offense to what this person is pointing out. They are more or less pointing out that it was Reagan's contributions to our economic system that led to the situation that pissed you guys off that made you want to vote for Trump in the first place, because Donald Trump made a lot of promises about how he was going to fix our economy. Now, whether or not he did is a discussion for a different time. The point is that what created the circumstances that led to Donald Trump being appealing was basically a bipartisan effort. So they're pretty hard on Reagan here, but again, it wasn't just him. Bill Clinton signed NAFTA into law, so let's talk about that. The North American Free Trade Agreement was the door through which American workers were shoved into the neoliberal global labor market. By establishing the principle that U.S. corporations could relocate production elsewhere and sell back into the United States, NAFTA undercut the bargaining power of American workers, which had driven the expansion of the middle class since the end of World War II. The result has been 20 years of stagnant wages and the upward redistribution of income, wealth, and political power. NAFTA affected U.S. workers in 4 principal ways. First, it caused the loss of some 700,000 jobs as production moved to Mexico. Most of these losses came in California, Texas, and Michigan, and other states where manufacturing is concentrated. To be sure, there were some job gains along the border in service and retail sectors resulting from the increased trucking activity, but these gains are small in relation to the losses and are in lower paying occupations. The mass majority of workers who lost jobs from NAFTA suffered a permanent loss of income. Secondly, NAFTA strengthened the ability of U.S. employers to force workers to accept lower wages and benefits. As soon as NAFTA became law, corporate managers began telling their workers that their companies intended to move to Mexico unless the workers lowered the cost of their labor. In the midst of collective bargaining negotiations with unions, some companies would even start loading machinery into trucks that they said was bound for Mexico. The same threats were used to fight union organizing efforts. The message was, if you vote in a union, we will move south of the border. With NAFTA, corporations also could more easily blackmail local governments into giving them tax reductions and other subsidies. Third, the destructive effect of NAFTA on the Mexican agricultural and small business sectors dislocated several million Mexican workers and their families and was a major cause in the dramatic increase in undocumented workers flowing into the U.S. labor market. This put further downward pressure on U.S. wages, especially in the already lower paying market for less skilled labor. Fourth, and ultimately most important, NAFTA was the template for rules of the emerging global economy, in which the benefits would flow to capital and the cost to labor. The U.S. governing class, in alliance with the financial elites of its trading partners, that would be the people Yuri was talking about, applied NAFTA's principles to the World Trade Organization, to the policies of the World Bank and IMF, and to the deal under which employers of China's huge supply of low-wage workers were allowed to access U.S. markets in exchange for allowing American multinational corporations the right to invest there. Here we have China, once again, the extremely wealthy, purchasing the rope they will be hung with because they're selling our economy to China. Despite the rhetoric, the central goal of NAFTA was not expanding trade. After all, the US, Mexico, and Canada had been trading goods and services with each other for 3 centuries. NAFTA's central purpose was to free American corporations from US laws protecting workers and the environment. Moreover, it paved the way for the rest of the neoliberal agenda in the US, the privatization of public services, the regulation of finance, and the destruction of the independent trade union movement. The inevitable result was to undercut workers' living standards all across North America. Wages and benefits have fallen behind worker productivity in all three countries. Moreover, despite declining wages in the United States, the gap between the typical American and the typical Mexican worker in manufacturing remains the same. Even after adjusting for differences in living costs, Mexican workers continue to make about 30% of the wages of workers in the United States. Thus, NAFTA is both symbol and substance of the global race to the bottom. So, the end result of both NAFTA and Reaganomics working together is the situation that you see here. These circumstances, these economic circumstances, are the reason that both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders were popular. They're also the reason why the system did everything they could to sabotage both of them. And also, as I pointed out in my previous video, because the left has their own problems with this, the reason why social justice matters are being pushed to the forefront as far as what should be your focus if you're an American citizen, instead of any attention being given to this situation. And in that video, which I guess I'll share in the cards at the end of this one, I pointed out that Hillary Clinton, for example, when addressing a crowd, specifically trying to turn them against Bernie Sanders, said, we could break up the big banks tomorrow, but what would that do to, gay rights, and how would that help black people, and et cetera, et cetera? It was all a distraction, for the left, and the right has just always been consistently distracted by, being told that their real problem is the poor. So, if you're, let's say, in the second column over here, maybe the 22%, or even the third column, which is, the 7%, you're being told that all of your economic woes are created by the column on the far left. When the truth is, the column on the far right, which is the 0.7%, are the reasons for all of these issues. They pushed for these economic policies. They are the ones that are destroying capitalism in the United States and making it unfunctional. So even if you're pro-capitalist, something has to be done about this. And you need to wake up to the fact that you are being manipulated to believe that your problem is the people on the left, figuratively, and directly. And there are people who are on the left who are a problem. I spent a hell of a lot of time on this channel pointing that out. There's no question. And again, I'm not trying to convert you. You can have whatever political ideology you want. But even if you're a capitalist, this is not sustainable. This situation is exactly what Yuri was warning about. If you become so obsessed with profits that you make the rules of capitalism so broken, people are going to want to play a different game. If you want a more modern example of this, you can just look at the fact that for some reason, those people on the far right of the column I just showed you are, 283 billion richer during the coronavirus pandemic. And, how exactly did that come about? Well, there was a lot of policies that were put in place to choke small businesses to death. And you can blame that on Democrats, I guess, but the truth is that's also a bipartisan effort. As I brought up in one of my previous videos, the response to the coronavirus came in two forms. On the left, they had this, 2 weeks of paid sick leave that would only have to be paid by the employers with 500 or less employees. So that was the small print part of it, but that was what the Democrat-controlled Congress at the time had put forth for coronavirus relief, which of course was only going to hurt small businesses and did not in any way harm anybody in that column on the far right. It did not harm any of the people that Yuri was talking about, the people who are so concerned about profits to the point that they don't even care about the long-term consequences of what it is that they're doing. But on the other side of that, the Republican-controlled Senate, all they offered was some relief checks that were going to go out and were going to be tax reduced in such a way that by the time they were done, the people who needed the most were going to get the least amount of money. And the wealthy people weren't going to get very much either. That's, meaning wealthy as in middle class. So there was really a bipartisan effort to ignore the people in that situation and only to uphold, again, Yuri's little group of capitalists. They were the only ones who did any better during the course of the pandemic. And once again, we're being distracted. We're being divided on this issue. We're not talking about the fact that the wealthy got 283 billion richer. We're talking about mask mandates or vaccine mandates. We're talking about, well, you're getting all that unemployment or what, that's what's basically being held to blame on all of this. And that's all a distraction. So in conclusion, thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation, particularly if you were on the right and conservative. My objective was not and is not to try and change your political affiliations. My objective is to point out that both the people who give a damn about other people on the left and the people who give a damn about other people on the right have a common enemy. And if you are really concerned about a communist invasion, then we have to address this enemy in their role in creating an environment that is vulnerable to the infiltration of communist ideology. Yuri was warning us that the super wealthy are selling the rope they will be hung with. We as Americans of both the left and the right need to take action to be sure that we are not swinging from the gallows with them. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. If you like my work, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I now only need 80 patrons total at $10 a month to get to my goal, which would allow me to continue to do this kind of work with the research and the guests and all of that you guys have come to love. Again, if I can't meet this goal, I'm not going to stop, but it would make it much more difficult for me to give you the same quality and frequency that you're used to here on V Radio. Thanks again for tuning in.